In this video, we fiberglass the board. In the last board, we used poor man's fiberglass technique. It's where you take a piece of canvas and using Teflon glue, you glue it to the surface. We glued it to foam. Some people glue it to plywood, and it's got its pluses and minuses. But in this one, we're actually using fiberglass cloth and epoxy resin. The technique isn't exactly the way the pros would do it, because what I'm actually using is just a table casting compound or a crafting compound, which is much less expensive than the compounds that you would use for boards or boats or that type of thing. So that's why I'm calling this a frugal man's fiberglass. I want to see how this stacks up against the poor man's fiberglass. The cloth that I'm using is some stuff that I had from a previous project. It's a very lightweight fiberglass cloth, but when I did some research on it in the past, you can get a 9-ounce fiberglass cloth for around the same price as I paid for the canvas on the poor man's fiberglass. On the last board, the Teflon glue costs about $17 as I remember it, and we paid about 45 bucks for the gallon of epoxy resin on this one. So it is a little bit more expensive, but I think that looking at the end of it, I think that the result is actually a bit nicer, and the extra 30 bucks is well worth it. Now I'm starting to glass, starting off by smoothing out the fiberglass on the board as much as we can. There'll still be some wrinkles, but getting most of them out. Now I'm trimming the glass to just below the edge of the board. You don't want too much, it'll get in the way. And also trimming the glass in the back. We'll be trimming it to an exact spot later. Unfortunately, this glass isn't quite wide enough. The board is a bit wider than the glass that I had on hand. I'm adding some cuts to the glass so that it'll sit flat once I epoxy it down. And then I add a layer of masking tape. I go down about 3/4 of the thickness of the board. I'm going to glass to the tape, maybe a little bit beyond it in some spots, but the tape is there as a line between where we're going to glass and where the glassing is going to stop on this level. Even if you're not super worried about chemicals and so forth, it's a good idea to have gloves on. If you don't have gloves on, you're going to end up with epoxy on your hands, and that's a sticky mess for a few hours until it cures. Even with gloves on, you're still going to get some on your hands. And this is the epoxy I'm using, Crafty Cast Epoxy. I'm weighing my epoxy out so I get my exact ratios. Unfortunately, it wasn't until I was at the end of the project that it came clear that this epoxy was mixed by volume, not by weight. As it turned out though, mixing by weight was close enough and the epoxy did harden. And mixing it up until it's clear all the way through. It doesn't look like there's two parts anymore, just one. I pour all the epoxy out of the container as quickly as I can, as often as I can, because thin layers of epoxy are going to cure slower than thick layers. It's a heat curing process. Spreading my epoxy out, I start off by just moving it around in thin layers, but then squeezing out as much of the epoxy out of the cloth as possible. I want the cloth to be fully loaded with epoxy, but not overly so. So I'm looking for that zip sound as the scraper goes over the epoxy cloth. One of the things that makes this whole job a lot easier is I have my wife helping me. We're mixing up small batches so I don't have to race the clock. Now I'm getting the epoxy over the edge and down to the tape, making sure that there's no dry spots and also that there's not any oversaturated spots. And this shows the cloth fairly well saturated, but at least all the way down to the tape. The results are pretty good. I still have a couple wet spots, but I'm trying to get them smoothed out as much as possible. And now I'm trimming the fiberglass to the tape. Pulling the tape away at an angle, you don't pull the fiberglass off the foam. We're not cutting it as it's fully cured, it's just partially cured now. Very sticky, almost cured, but not hard yet. And now for a layer on the other side of the board. And now for a piece along the edges. I took the length of fiberglass and cut it into 4 strips of equal width. Getting the epoxy on the edges was fairly challenging because you're going with a very narrow strip on the top and wider edges along the sides, and it's kind of hard to keep the epoxy from dripping down the edge of the board. And now for a second layer on the bottom. And a second layer on the top. The fiberglass cloth I'm using is a super lightweight cloth, and what I've seen other guys do is wet several layers at a time. So that I'm going to give it a shot. I've got 3 layers down. The smallest layer is on the bottom, a little bit bigger in the middle, and the biggest on the top. As I put the epoxy down, it seemed like it was working out okay, but once the epoxy cured, with 3 layers of cloth down, I had all kinds of blisters in between the layers. I'm not sure why the blisters were there. Maybe I was epoxy starved, not enough epoxy in the cloth. Who knows? But it certainly didn't work out as well as I would have liked. On the bottom, for the final layer of glass, I tried putting just 2 layers of glass down. Once again, smaller on the bottom and then a bigger piece on the top. Once again, we still came up with blisters, so doing 2 layers of cloth at the same time wasn't working out too well for me. In the next video, we'll place the fins and do a review on the board, and then I'm considering this project complete.